Hello, it's Andrew and back with another of my YouTube videos. For those of you who've seen them before, you'll probably know they're all pretty much unscripted, done with one take. Now, um, I'm currently reading a book here. It's called The Prime Ministers, Reflections on Leadership from Wilson to May by Steve Richards. About a third of the way through, I've been reading it for a few days. Uh, Very interesting book. I might talk about it in another video. I'll do a review on Amazon. Very interesting book. Though I do have um, a few reservations about it, but that's not what I'm actually here to talk about. The reason I mention it is, in one way, it's an inspiration for this video because Steve Richards quite often does on political lectures on the BBC, and he talks on a subject for about half an hour, and they're unscripted. I've done quite a few unscripted, quite lengthy political videos on YouTube, but they normally, I think 17 minutes is the longest unscripted one I've done. So what I'm going to talk about today is Boris Johnson. Now today is 2 days after the Supreme Court judgment on prorogation of Parliament, and 1 day after the absolutely appalling performance from Boris Johnson in Parliament, which basically set off a lot of anger all round the House of Commons last night. And today John Bercow, the Speaker, has said he has never seen such dreadful scenes in the whole of his 22 years. I think he said he's been in, 22 years. So let's just, hundreds, thousands of people have commented on the mainstream media, social media about this. I'm not expecting my particular comments will take off particularly, but I just feel very angry about what's going on and concerned. And as someone who's written quite a lot about politics and history over the years, I just thought I'd give my thoughts on the situation and try and put it into perspective in the way I see it. Now, basically, Boris Johnson, after several weeks of assuring people that he would not be proroguing Parliament, where Brexiteers were saying, let's prorogue Parliament, and then Parliament can't stop us leaving the EU without a deal if we want to leave without a deal, if we haven't agreed a deal. So basically, he just, after weeks of the various government ministers and spokesmen denying it was even going to happen, and even when court cases trying to prevent it from happening were underway, the government's lawyers were still saying this is academic, this is not the government's intention to do it. Suddenly, there's an announcement that Parliament's to be prorogued. Now, so hurriedly, 3 members of the Privy Council, led by Jacob Rees-Mogg, were sent off to advise the Queen to do this. There are 700 about members of the Privy Council, but because the quorum's 3, basically there are arguments about this, about whether the Queen can disregard the advice or question the advice of the Privy Council. Opinions are divided on this. I personally think if the Queen's got a Privy Council of up to 700 members to advise her, I do think she had the option of actually asking advice from others than the 3 members of the current government who are trying to slow down Parliament. Anyway, as we all know, there was a protracted legal battles and much discussion in Parliament in that brief period when it returned after the summer recess, but then before prorogation. The European Withdrawal Number 2 Act, I think is the correct title, but known generally as the Ben Act, was put in place that said that if by October the 19th the government has not either got a withdrawal agreement approved by Parliament or explicit agreement of Parliament to leave the EU without a deal, then Boris Johnson has to go to the EU to request an extension, and he has to accept an extension if it's given. Anyway, so going back to prorogation, which of course the government said, it's all about preparing for the Queen's speech. Normally it's a 1-week prorogation. This time they wanted 5 weeks. I don't know why would they have to close down Parliament for 5 whole weeks, stopping all of the MPs working and scrutinised the government for 5 whole weeks, just so the cabinet could cobble together a few ideas to put in a Queen's speech. Well, as everybody says, it's normally a few days. There was much speculation about what the Supreme Court would decide. The Supreme Court decided by a unanimous 11-0 verdict that the government had unlawfully closed down Parliament and given misleading sort of plan had been used to persuade the Queen to prorogue Parliament, that this was unlawful and immediately and of no effect, and Parliament should be resumed as soon as possible. So there you have it. The highest court in the land, unanimously, 11 judges have said that Boris Johnson and his government have ridden roughshod over constitutional convention and have carried out an unlawful act. So Parliament resumed yesterday, and the Attorney General, Geoffrey Cox, was asked about the legal advice that he gave. The summary is that he thought it was legal. He then claimed it was legal at the time he gave the advice, but the judgment of the Supreme Court has sort of changed the law, which it hasn't. It's interpreted the law to show that the government doesn't have the royal prerogative to just shut down Parliament for 5 weeks to stop debate. So anyway, he was asked, because there have been concerns about the government trying to avoid implementing the Benn Act, and these concerns actually come on the basis that several government ministers have suggested that the government may not comply with the Act. The Attorney General was asked specifically yesterday, would the government comply with the Act? He, without hesitation, said yes. Last night, the same question, exactly the same question, with the caveats about we understand the steps that have to be taken, but if we get that point, October 19th, that the Benn Act, the provisions apply, will the Prime Minister ask for an extension? And without hesitation, he said no. So we don't know what the government's view on this is. At the start, quite early on in his lengthy statement, followed by lengthy questions, Boris Johnson, now you think he would have resigned, given the constitutional crisis that he has created and the fact he's been found by the highest court in the land to have acted unlawfully. You think any Prime Minister with any decency would apologise and resign. What did he do? He turned up in Parliament and just said, well, I respect... You know how he speaks. Actually, I don't want to do an impersonation of him because he's not a joke figure. He's actually a very dangerous figure. But amongst all his usual bluster, he said, yes, I respect the law, but the Supreme Court got it wrong. I don't agree with them. His tone and his language as the evening wore on became increasingly divisive. He continually referred to the Benn Act as the Surrender Act. He and his supporters, government ministers, have talked about surrender, collaboration with Europe. A lot of the Brexiteers have been talking about people being traitors. And the rhetoric has become increasingly nasty. And several women Labour MPs who were friends of Jo Cox said they were very upset because they have been receiving death threats, the intensity of which has increased recently, and people are actually quoting Boris Johnson's words. And one Paula Sheriff, she was particularly upset, and she said, this is what I'm receiving, and how can the Prime Minister talk in such inflammatory terms? And when we think about what's happened to Jo Cox, and he just said, I've never heard so much humbug in my life. Now, we all get used to being angry about politics, but I think that is one of the most disgusting things I've ever heard a Prime Minister or a senior politician say. I just couldn't believe it, and nor could various other people. So as I say, the atmosphere got very ugly last night when, at the end of the questions, points of order were raised. Boris Johnson skittled out of the chamber as quickly as possible, even though John Bercow tried to persuade him as an act of courtesy to stay and listen. Today, there were two specific urgent questions directed to the Prime Minister, one of which was asking about what is the government's position on the Ben Act, and the other one was, would he like to consider his comments last night, and would he take action to the cat. Hello, Misty. Misty's in the corner. She's woken up. Would he like to reflect upon his words and just see what he can do to improve the tone of debate in Parliament, given the toxic atmosphere? What did he do? He refused to even turn up for either of these questions. He got junior ministers to waffle on his behalf. We still don't know whether the Ben Act will be implemented by the government. This evening, there's rumours they're going to use emergency powers to claim it's a national crisis and that they can overrule the Ben Act and just leave the EU without a deal. Don't happen often, but I really am lost for words with some of the things that they're saying and doing at the moment. So I say Boris Johnson refused to turn up in Parliament today to answer these questions. He was talking to journalists, and he said that, basically he just said that although he didn't want anybody, he didn't agree with the abuse of MPs and threats to MPs, but he said he should be allowed to speak freely, and the Surrender Act is a surrender, and he will carry on talking about this. And the media have been reporting today that the cabinet met earlier this evening, and they have done polling, and apparently a lot of people in the country like this talk of this dreadful rhetoric, this talk of surrender, and really raising the stakes and raising a lot of division and hatred. Now, perhaps I should have said this at the start of this piece. I'm a member of the Labour Party, so obviously I've got a view. I'm not likely to be in any way sympathetic to Boris Johnson. I did vote to leave the European Union. I did a video a few months ago explaining the socialist case to leave the European Union. It's known as Lexit, short for left exit. We were told at the time of the referendum, I didn't believe that the Tories were going to put more money into the NHS. I very rarely believe anything the Tories say. But one thing that I did believe was that we would leave the European Union with a sensible deal. Now, it's 3.25 years on from the referendum, due to total lack of planning from the Conservatives about what would happen if people voted to leave, constant disagreement amongst the government, their increasing minority position in Parliament. They basically can't get anything through, and there are rumours that they might try to prorogue Parliament again. I said this thing about using emergency powers. I don't know what's going to happen. None of us seem to know what's going to happen from day to day at the moment in this increasing crisis, which brings me on to another point I was going to make. Now, we keep on hearing that Britain's in constitutional crisis, which, the points I've made already in this video, yes, I have no doubt Britain is in a constitutional crisis. We have, Parliament was the attempt to close down Parliament for 5 weeks. The government that doesn't believe in the rule of law anymore, and now, so what when was the last time there was a crisis like this? Now, I say people keep saying, "Oh, it is a crisis. It's the worst crisis since," and nobody's actually tried that I've seen has actually pinned it down. So I would say that the as I mentioned another book, which I have mentioned once or twice modestly before. This is Why Not Trust the Conservatives, which is an attempt to provide a. It's inspired by the great Aneurin Bevan, founder of the NHS, who wrote a book called Why Not Trust the Tories. So this is a survey of the Conservative Party's history and the reasons why we shouldn't trust them. Now, I would say the biggest constitutional crisis, the only one in the 20th century, basically this is the biggest constitutional crisis since that of 1912 to 1914, which was when a minority Liberal government with support from Irish nationalist MPs were planning to give home rule to Ireland. Now, the Conservatives, they were actually called the Unionist Party at the time, were implacably opposed to this. Now, I'd just like to read a quote here from the book. So basically what we're saying is the plan was to give not complete independence, but home rule, self-government to the whole of Ireland. The Tories were particularly worried about the Protestant part that became Northern Ireland. In fact, there were Ulster, which from memory, there's 9 counties in Ulster, but only 6 of them became part of Northern Ireland. And the reason only 6 of them became part of Northern Ireland because they were the counties where the Conservatives thought that they had an electoral majority. They were interested in the other 3 counties of Ulster, despite the fact they claimed they were interested in Ulster. In fact, at one stage, they were actually thinking about Northern Ireland only being 4 counties. So that's total cynicism. Anyway, so to come back to the quote. So Bonar Law was their leader at the time. And I put here, I read right here. We're talking about 1912 at the moment. On July the 29th, Law attended a Unionist demonstration against Home Rule at Blenheim Palace and made a speech about the possibility that Ulster would be forced to submit to a parliament at Dublin. Law said, quote, "If such an attempt is made, I can imagine no length of resistance to which Ulster can go in which I should not be prepared to support them." It was, no, end of quote, my analysis. It was characteristic of the Conservatives that Law, who had more respect for democracy than other leaders of the party, was to demonstrate a willingness to resist a democratic process where he felt the issue demanded it. Law suggested to the king that he might dismiss the government rather than give his royal assent should Home Rule be passed, but the king declined this autocratic suggestion. Law pessimistically foresaw civil war as a result of his party's resistance to the government, but remained opposed to compromise over Ulster. Now, the parliamentary and political struggle over Home Rule continued into 1914. Now, and in 1914, we have the Unionists basically set up a paramilitary organisation, the Ulster Volunteer Force. And bear in mind, this is 1914, only a few months before Britain goes to war with Germany. They actually bought a large shipment of arms from Germany and smuggled it into Ireland to be used to fight against the British Army as the British Army tried to quell the rebellion, the Protestant Unionist rebellion. The Bonar Law was actually considering, and the Conservative Unionist Shadow Cabinet actually wanted to basically use the annual army bill. There used to be an annual bill to Parliament to approve a standing army for Britain. They actually wanted to close down the British Army. So Britain has reached the point of civil war, or at least Ireland has, with help from the British Unionists. And it was only the international crisis and the start of World War One that stopped this. So that was it. Britain might have actually been without an army at the start of the war if the Unions got their way. And the Ulster Volunteer Force, yes, some people may think, oh, that sounds familiar. Yes, the Ulster Volunteer Force, who continued through the Troubles in recent decades in Northern Ireland to act as a Protestant terrorist organisation, and who is their political supporters? The so-called Democratic Unionist Party. And who do the DUP support? Yes, they support the Tories in government in return for, well, money basically. More money goes to Northern Ireland in return for the DUP supporting the Tories. The DUP are the ones saying that really leading the campaign against the Northern Ireland backstop. What doesn't get mentioned enough is that all the constituencies that are on the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland actually voted for Sinn Féin MPs and not the DUP. The DUP speak for about half of Northern Ireland. They do not speak for the constituencies on the Northern Ireland border, and the majority of the voters in the referendum in Northern Ireland voted to remain. But because the DUP are there propping up the Tories, then the DUP get their way, or at least they used to get their way. But as defections and the withdrawal of the whip has made the Conservative Party government under Johnson lose its small majority, even with the DUP, and now be in a minority situation, I'm not quite sure. Well, the Tories are still appeasing the DUP. So a lot of people really are worried about the political situation in Britain, and I hope this video has been of some interest. Sorry I've not been my usual jolly self that I am in these videos, but unfortunately it's not a laughing matter. We have a very dangerous Prime Minister who, well, there's numerous examples. I haven't spoken about them in this video. There's numerous examples of his sexism, his racism, his appalling comments, his general lack of respect for people, his very dodgy business dealings, day after day we know more about how dreadful he is. Hopefully he will be gone as Prime Minister soon. I am hoping that there will be a vote of no confidence in him in the formation of either a minority Labour government or a coalition government very soon to see Britain through a Brexit that means we leave with a deal. I've now spoken for, the time tells me 23 minutes, which is longer than I planned, but there is a lot to cover, and I hope this has been of some interest. Thank you. Good night.